Okay, so our next speaker is Morgan Varner from Tall Timbers, and the title of your talk is Offense and Defense, How Florida Plants Live with Fire. I'll stand over here after about half an hour and ask you to wrap up, okay? Thanks.
Great. Thank you. Okay, when I was asked to submit a title, it was the peak of college football talking season. And we were winning. I won't reveal who we were, but we were winning talking season. I was really excited and overly optimistic for the fall. And here we are a little later in the year. Anyway, so ignore that first part, but what I want to do is talk to you about what I'm pretty passionate about, plants and fire and their marriage. Okay. And this is the stuff I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about fire in the region, just how much of it there is, how long it's been here. I'm going to talk about plant defense, and I'm going to talk about plant offense. Okay. I know you all love looking at maps like I do. So this first one is a map of what we would call the fire regimes of the conterminous United States. A few things are going to jump out at you. First of all, you jump to your favorite pixel, your spot, and I think most of us in the room are focused on this little area here that we've been pointing to, looking at hurricane tracks or other rare events. And what you can see is this area of the Panhandle of Florida sits in a fire regime, a historic fire regime defined by climate and probably humans, that is the most frequent in the conterminous United States. Indeed, it's one of the most frequent on the entire planet. And if you can read those tiny numbers are biennial, or fires every 2 years across every spot in the uplands, which is a miracle and amazing if you look at it across the planet. That's 5 fires would occur in a single spot in a decade. That is, on the planet, almost unprecedented. What else do you see on there? The West is a hodgepodge in this pockmarked surface that tracks climate very closely. And you see other spots where fires are frequent that fill the news, either Northern California, the Northern Rockies, or Southern California and the famous Santa Ana fires. The United States is very diverse with fire, like most places on the planet, except for the Southeast, where you see this somewhat boring, although overwhelming fire frequency. This is based on climate. This model has been in development for a long time, and the way we evaluate it is we compare it to the record, and the record we tend to use is, our most common record that is annual resolution, is fire scars. Fire, because it is hot and because trees insulate themselves not that well usually, they will reveal when a fire occurred and show a scar, a wound that will record fire for the length of time that the wood doesn't decay. And with a lot of our species in the Southeast, they tend to hold those scars both through their life, in their death, and sometimes when we unearth them from creeks and rivers after they've been buried for a long time, we'll find really, really long fire records. And guess what we find? We find fire scar evidence that is at least as frequent as the climate, but more often, more frequent than the climate. Given to what all of you have been talking about, or at least this morning, very long evidence of human occupation, heavy human occupation, particularly in the Southeast and in our local area. People, just like they have always been, using fire. If we look at contemporary fire, if we were trying to compare this goofy looking map here to this map here, we're putting it in state boundaries because we have a really poor estimate of how much fire occurs across the United States, but basically the darker colors are where more fire is happening, and these fires here in this map are solely prescribed fires. Is that surprising to you? You see these really dark areas. The darkest areas are the areas in Kansas where there's a ton of prescribed fire, and the Southeast. because the author of the study was a Georgian, and they picked a minimum threshold for the dark color, Georgia looks the same as Florida, but Florida dwarfs all other states in prescribed fire. Consistently number one, even if they inflate their numbers, we'd still be number one. Okay. But the Southeast in general, burning a lot. And if you zoom in on that and start to get it really at much finer scale, what you'd see is a few real hot spots of prescribed fire. The hottest spot is where we're standing right now. It is Thomas County, Georgia, number one in the United States, little tiny Thomas County. Number 3 in the United States is Leon County. That happens to be the state capital and a place with a tremendous human population, tourist industry, international airport, et cetera, et cetera. And we're sitting in, right now, number 6, maybe number 5 in the country, rural Jefferson County. So lots of fire, and you can see it here reflected in this really hot spot where Tallahassee, Leon County has about 95,000 acres of prescribed fire a year. The entire state of California burns about 90,000 acres of prescribed fire a year. Thomas County burns about 110,000 pretty consistently. So tons of fire happening now. I'd like to say similar to how it has been for the last several thousand years, but that's not the case. Where we are, it's approximating it, but we're one of the very few spots on the entire planet where we are approximating what was 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago with fire frequency. From a plant or animal standpoint, that should be really depressing to you. Because what happens with really, really frequent fire is beyond the forces of climate, beyond the forces of the physical environment, it tends to generate really cool species that are, that from an animal standpoint, they can fly away, crawl away, slither away, bury themselves, go into holes, somehow evade the lethal fire. And so you end up with really neat species. I'd like to use the word exotic just because they're so dang cool, but you get really cool mammals, you get incredible herpetofauna, really cool insects that are tightly cued to a fire regime, to those characteristics of frequency or of severity. You also get game species that are world-renowned, and you get pretty cute tortoises that are we could talk for the entire 30 minutes on just one of these species. But I'm not going to talk about those. What I'm going to talk about is plants. Okay, like 3 of you. Okay. Because plants can't run away, they also have really elaborate adaptations to fire. Fire is, I mentioned the word lethal, can be really lethal to plants. They are anchored in place. They're there trying to capture sunlight for 364 days of the year, or 730 days of 2 years, and that one day, rather than being there capturing light, taking up water and nutrients from the soil, doing their normal daily functions, they are interrupted by something that's lethal. Something that's lethal, and as that map suggested, fairly predictable and quite regular or high in its frequency. And so you end up getting pretty elaborate adaptations. I'm going to go through a few of these, but this is a hint of where we're headed. I said I would touch on the antiquity of fire in the region, because part of what drives the evolution of traits, which is what we're going to focus on, is there being a pressure that is there, that is somewhat unique in its characteristics, that generates a freakish occurrence, and that freakish occurrence then becomes an advantage to long-term persistence. And fire, as long as this peninsula or this spot where we are in Florida has been above water, has been present. As long as we have sufficient oxygen, as long as there is sufficient carbon dioxide to help generate plants that would then be fuel, and as long as there is an ignition source. And prior to humans, we had lightning. Lightning generates fires all over the world, still does today. And as you all know much better than I, we've also had a really long human history here. Probably, over these many thousands of years, this is a constant topic in fire ecology and an overlap with a lot of your interests. What's the first use by humans of fire? It is really difficult. It's basically a let's one up the last paper, let's get to the most outrageous number. Obviously, in early humans, we're looking at more than 1 million years. Certainly in our continent, as long as we have been here, whatever number of thousands of years you have, is it 30, is it 40, is it 26? Many thousands of years here, and we know across the planet, wherever people are, they used fire. Because it is an extensive landscape tool, it's something you can use with a single spot. You can affect a very large landscape, requiring very little labor on your part. Rather than you trying to hack down an individual tree, you could kill an entire forest or change the species composition of an entire landscape with a single strike or you carrying or transporting fire. So fire is widespread and frequent, two key characteristics so that plants become interesting. I have to mention a little bit about just a single slide to bore you and make you feel sad or angry, and that is, it's not all a great history of fire in this region. The 20th century stood out as the worst period for fire probably in 20,000 years in North Florida, which is kind of amazing to think about. The 20th century was defined from a fire perspective and therefore an animal and plant perspective by a government campaign to stomp out fire. It started in newspapers in Montgomery, Alabama with a couple of plant biologists, a couple of botanists arguing. It started in DC with the young U.S. Forest Service trying to find some hook that they could really control their own future, and it started in large wildfires in the West that are the most famous for it, where they were debating the role of fire. A lot of it had, and I think this is very appropriate for today, a lot of it was linked to racism. It was, we characterized indigenous fire as something that was less than what European colonists were proposing, less than what modern forestry, etc., even though forestry was just young at that time. So it was a direct attack at indigenous practices. It was called Paiute forestry in some sort of denigration of their practices. It was also linked to regionalism. This is a picture of my great-grandfather who was from Perry County. He was a turpentiner, and because you're a turpentiner, you're also a protector of your resource, and you burn a lot. And this regionalism spawned a multi-decade process that began with the folks that proselytized in small movie theaters throughout the South, called themselves the Dixie Crusaders or the Southern Forestry Education Project. That then begat the creation of Smoky, and it led this large campaign that it matters from a story about fire and a story about fire and plants and people. Also appropriate for today, the leaders in fighting this were folks who lived in Tallahassee and Thomasville in the Red Hills. The first of those is Ellen Call Long. If you're a Tallahassean or you like to hang out in downtown Tallahassee, you know Call Street. Call Street was named for our territorial governor, Call, whose daughter was Ellen, or one of his children, and the child who then held the property, the grove that many of you visited, And Ellen Call Long was a iconoclast in the 1880s, prior to the cessation of fire. She was at conferences. This is a time when women couldn't vote, but she was there at conferences talking about fire and how it maintained beautiful open forests, and basically talking about fire impacts on biodiversity. So she was pretty incredible and a great leader. Yay, Tallahassee. And then some men. These folks here, Herbert Stoddard on the far left, and Ed Komarek sitting next to him, the founders of Tall Timbers, along with Colonel Thompson and Henry Beadle, that had the very first, what they were pairing fire, plants, and animals in this new field they defined called fire ecology. Almost 64 years ago, their first conference in the world held here in Tallahassee. All right, I digressed a little bit. We're talking about fire. And so the first thing, I work in fire, and what I mean by that is I'm in the middle of fire to measure things because I want to know how plants are functioning. And what folks often say is, oh my gosh, that must be the craziest, that there's a camp of those folks, and then the other folks on the other side go, oh, I've seen little cute fire before. I've seen little tiny flames. So here's a fire that we worked on where I'm in the middle of it, my postdoc's taking the video. This is something like what the lethal effects of fire are. That's really hot. Those temperatures are far in excess of what would kill plant cells, and there's a lot of stuff happening in that image. There is multiple forms of heat transfer. Plants that are small are going to suffer. Plants that you can see they're trying to move around to evade the heat effects. And you also see smoke, and smoke has all sorts of untold effects on these ecosystems. So to weather that, plants have some adaptations. I want to go through those. I think they start to tell some of the cool Florida story. One way you evade this is by generating bark, and generating bark early in your lifespan. Overproducing bark when the other evolutionary cues suggest you shouldn't do it. Bark is typically there for retention of water, protection from mechanical injury, protection from herbivores, and it's also there for fire protection. This is turkey oak, one of the dominants of North Florida. It's a heavy heavy overbark producer. Here it is without fire, here it is with fire. This is a false color infrared, and what you can see is blobs of color that are the hottest spots on that bark are not there in the valleys next to the stem where the bark thickness is the lowest, but it's out on the ridges, out on these fins that are there where the heat is being deposited. And what those valleys are doing is, just like any valley would do, when air is pressed on it, they're convecting. And so they're creating this little boundary layer, this little protected blanket of air that's keeping the cambium from being injured. Species do it across the planet, where if you're blindfolded and dropped somewhere in the world and you see thickened bark that has this thin pattern, it is likely some adaptation to resist heat's effects. You can see in that image there species that are really dramatically overproducing fire, and they're doing it almost like a daisy form. Asteriform bark is what we call that, like an aster, like a sunflower. And then you see that other species of the same age not producing thickened bark at all. A fire-adapted, you might say, species, and a non-fire-adapted species. Okay, adaptation 1, bark. Adaptation group 2. Reproductive and juvenile oddities is the big blob category that I'm making for that, and that is that most famously the grass stage of longleaf pine. Longleaf pine, if you're reading a book on fire ecology in South Africa, there's going to be a picture of longleaf pine from Florida or Alabama or Georgia because it is such a freakish adaptation. Here it is just starting to emerge from the grass stage, but not growing like a pine tree should vertically, but instead developing its root structure and having this protective leaves that surround its bud to protect it. There's also cone serotiny, where cones are cemented closed until they have a certain amount of heating, and then they open and they release their seeds. This is most famous from Yellowstone that we all watched movies of when we were young, but is also a Florida adaptation with sand pine of the peninsula. It might be some sort of weird, what we call precocious or early flowering, like wiregrass. Here it is fruiting. It's a species that is a common dominant that only fruits, or at least fruits with the most robustness, following fire, and following fire in a relatively narrow period of the year. And then there's a little hypoxis here, this cute little grass, or grass-like, grass-looking dicot. What it does is it flowers almost immediately after fire, and so if you've walked through the Apalachicola following fire within about 2 or 3 weeks, what you'll see is a blackened surface and little yellow flowers already popping up. So it's going through almost its entire life cycle within a couple of weeks, which is, again, phenomenal from the global standpoint. Adaptation group number 3. Not investing in bark, not investing in these other things, but just saying we're just going to resprout. We'll basically start all over again. And so that means you'd have to invest in pretty dramatic below ground resources. And we see this with lots of different species. Almost all of the angiosperms do this. Here's an oak in northwestern California on the Dillon Fire, Kevin, pre-Dillon Fire. Resprouting following what we call top killing, where the above ground structure is killed and they just resprout. This is a shortleaf pine from tall timbers from Leon County that is resprouting, and we find these resprouting numbers of times, and their number of resprouts numbers in the 50, 60, sometimes up to 100 resprouts. The most famous of these, or the regional famous one, is wiregrass. This is wiregrass. You can see this is a zoomed in me laying on the ground taking a picture of it. This is following fire, and this is 2 days after fire in Thomas County, Georgia. 2 days after fire, it has already sloughed off the ash and is already starting to grow vertically again. A dramatic, very quick post-fire recovery. Maybe the most famous, though, is the suckering of aspen of the West. This is central Utah. Immediately following fire, where the above ground portion is killed and they're just investing in, and these are suckers, these are oddities of the resprouting world. So obviously very successful, just starting over. Another way to survive and persist with fire is to be able to weather the storm. A really common characteristic of March and April and sometimes early May in North Florida is a browned canopy. Not just individual trees, but every tree out there looks like it's brown. This is a phenomenon we call crown scorch. And from an outsider, someone who hasn't seen that very often, they'll freak out about it. But the species here, in particular the southern pines, have a globally remarkable capacity to refoliate. They either refoliate from their bud, which you can see here, this is zoomed in to a bud on the ground of a longleaf pine, or they will, like shortleaf pine, just build a new branch, which is amazing given that fire is occurring every 2 years, that they're basically taking that heavy investment they have in branches and just doing it all over again. They're doing it in these landscapes because the landscape is now blackened surface. The soil is warm, it's coated in ash, which is fertilizer, and the competition has gone down. And so what seemingly is a knock at their growth is actually a great benefit to them. There's also this odd phenomenon. You can see this. Someone who's trained in plant physiology, an oddity has always been to look at the stem of a tree and see sunshine all over it. If you think about that, that's wasted incoming solar radiation. It's striking the bark, and most mature plants cannot photosynthesize across their bark. Why in the world would they do this? And so if you look at this picture here, there's some loblolly pine in southeast Virginia. Why are these stems without foliage? The easiest path from a water transport situation is to have low branches. That there's still sunlight passing through in these savanna systems. They're wasting sunlight. They're doing it because the long evolutionary pressure take your branches higher and higher to evade heat effects. So this self-pruning, branch shedding, or what folks will call cladotopsis, is another great adaptation. And it's ubiquitous in Florida. You're all looking at the screen going, yeah, don't all trees do that? It is in North Florida because these trees have had a long relationship with fire. Okay. Each of these has really been a very defensive. That is, evade it by getting your crown high, thicken bark around your bowl, protect your seeds by having a waxy coating on your, or a resinous coating on your cone. And now here's an offensive trait, plant flammability, which has been termed in the past the kill thy neighbor strategy. If you could cast your dead leaves on your neighbor, and those dead leaves burned at a really high temperature, or they burned in some other way that was really lethal, you could create a zone that surrounded you. I'm anthropomorphizing a tree now. You could create a zone around you that was lethal to other plants. And indeed, what we find when we do this is that pattern is all over the world. And in particular with a few genera that will be familiar to you. These are the pines of the United States. This tree here is their phylogenetic tree that is showing where pines are in relation to other pines. This bright color here, that in these branches of this phylogenetic tree, are species that burn with really high intensity. These really high intensity species include a bunch of species from the local area. In fact, if you burn all the species in the United States, all pines in the United States, which we've done, the top 4 are all North Florida species. Number 1 is longleaf pine, number 2 is pond pine that occurs all over North Florida in wet areas. Number 3 is loblolly pine, and number 4 is shortleaf pine, our 4 dominant pines of the region, pond pine not being that dominant. But across the United States, the 4 most are right here in North Florida. And those tend to be, we think, are largely related to terpene chemistry. What you smell when you walk into a pine forest, what you smell like when you've walked out of a pine forest, those terpenes driving it, and that is related to their evolutionary history. When we look at oaks, what we find is, you don't need to see what these relationships are, but you need to just, if you're a scientist, you never find relationships that basically track a perfect line. These R squares here are all 0.95 or higher. It's amazing, and it's just based on their physical traits. Oaks are tremendously diverse in their structure, and we find that that tracks their flammability really closely. If you were looking for oaks in North Florida, which ones would they fall into? They would look a lot like this. They're deeply dissected, they're large, they're long, and that fits this flammability. When we've done this though, so we have pines and we have oaks, and if we were a little farther north, we might have this species here that is scattered and actually has historically slopped over into Florida, certainly in South Georgia and Central Alabama. American chestnut, many of you know, is functionally extinct, even though it is present and now trying to be reintroduced. The most flammable of any species we've ever measured is not longleaf pine, it is American chestnut, probably the missing link for fire in many areas. All of these individual traits I just talked about, the offensive and the defensive, pair with physiology, they pair with a complexity of traits that fall into some syndromes. If you have really flammable litter, guess what you do? You protect yourself with really early investment in juvenile bark. You also prune yourself really readily. You would never not prune yourself and have flammable litter, because then you would cast flammable litter and do what? Kill yourself. Species don't do that, or plant species don't. They're actually brilliant. And so they fall into these different sorts of categories. And what we're finding increasingly is the relationship is really complicated. Okay, to get back and to sour our relationship that we all just built, if we're talking about defense and offense, again, I'm not going to share who my team is here, but what we've thought about traditionally in our field of fire ecology is that plants are at the mercy of fire, they're at the mercy of the environment. So they defend. And that means that you make thick bark, you prune yourself, you go through all those individual structures. But what this new view, and I think it's really powerful to think about it, and that's what I want you to leave here with, is that they defend and they also have an offense. Plants are structuring their local environment through their litter and through their flammability. And it is this just as if fire were an herbivore, which we've often compared it to. If you have an herbivore and a plant, and the herbivore is really successful, the plant either goes extinct or it figures out another trick, and you start to get this reciprocal relationship, and they develop these oddities that we're all aware of in the plant world. And that is really what's happening with fire. We happen to be in a location in the planet where these get pretty elaborate. We have these weird flowers, we have these species that have serotinous cones, and we have these species that have really, really flammable litter. And if you think about it, as long as the vegetation has been here, depending on if species reproduce at really old ages or they're annuals, they've been through tens of thousands of generations. And so this pressure here has been there for a long time, creating these landscapes that are tolerant of fire. And as you walk out into the woods and look at the high diversity of species, that we're in a globally significant biodiversity region, you can think about these species for their botanical traits. You can also start to break them out and think about them from how they burn in these environments and how they contribute to these elaborate adaptations that species have here. With that, I'll close.
You have a few minutes for questions. If you'd like to take a question,
Okay.
we have time for questions.